We have our former senior pastor, Reverend Jim Edgerly, speaking about the war in Ukraine in the era of high noon. Reverend Edgerly is the founder of the Higher Purpose Forum, and this is the work that he's been working on for many years, is how can we bring God's perspective into the most important issues of the day? Because we remember the fall of man was caused by the four fallen natures, and the very first of those natures is a failure to see from God's perspective. So the original nature, that is counterpart to that fallen nature, is to see your brothers and sisters and to see the world from God's perspective. So that's what Reverend Edgerly has been working on. And I wish him the greatest of luck in that, and he's even got me to join in a little bit in the Higher Purpose Forum, and I look forward to our working together on that. But without further ado, I would love to introduce actually there's one more thing I want to mention about Reverend Edgerly. He's worked for many years in Eastern Europe, and this was news to me a few weeks ago, but he mentioned this to me when I was preparing my sermon about the war in Ukraine. And so it was very beneficial. He offered to talk to me. We talked for over an hour about this, and he really has a unique insight, I feel, among Americans, as somebody who's actually been there and worked with those people. So now, without further ado, I would love to welcome up Reverend Edgerly.
Good morning. What a great band. Yeah. Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Kim, for leading us in Hodo Arirang. That's really the perfect song for this morning's message. On February 24th, Russia initiated a war in Europe, very significant war in Europe, invading Ukraine. No one can guess how big this war will become, how many lives will be lost, how many families will be destroyed, how much of European history, structures, and institutions will be leveled, and how this war can possibly be brought to an end. We just have to pray for this war to end. Estimates are that within the first 2 weeks, over 10,000 people in just the first 2 weeks were killed, including Ukrainian soldiers, Ukrainian civilians, Russian soldiers. As of yesterday, over 2.5 million people, Ukrainians, have had to flee their country, and hundreds of thousands of people are fleeing Ukraine every day. Inside Ukraine, there's a severe humanitarian crisis underway in a number of cities. And it seems that the worst situation is in Mariupol, where over 1,500 civilians have already passed away, some being buried in mass graves. The city has been completely cut off from the outside world, with no humanitarian corridor being established. No one gets in or out. Temperatures are below freezing every day. There's almost no food, almost no water, no electricity, no heat. Today, people in Mariupol are freezing to death and starving to death. In the center of the city of Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city, there was numerous universities, important cultural institution, government buildings in the middle of this beautiful, proud city. Those historical assets are now gone, completely destroyed in the center of that city by rockets and artillery fire. In Russia today, almost 14,000 protesters have been detained thus far, according to the Human Rights the Russian human rights monitoring group, OVD Info. I know this is a very unusual way to begin a sermon. Sermons should be guided by God's word, should be uplifting and inspiring, and relate to our innermost personal circumstances. Despite this unusual beginning, I hope still that this sermon can accomplish that. However, our Heavenly Parent, God, our Heavenly Parent, most definitely cares deeply about what's happening to His children in Ukraine. These are His children who are fighting with each other, who are suffering so terribly. This is His history of restoration, His providence that is at stake. We're all to be filial children according to the teachings of our beloved Dr. Young. We're all to live with God as in a filial relationship, concerning ourselves with the matters that concern God. And therefore, we have to concern ourselves with what's happening in Ukraine. Today, I'd like to explore my understanding of a principled perspective on what's happening in Ukraine. This, I hope, does not in any way duplicate what you can hear about on CNN or on BBC. Those are the two sources I'm following most closely. Or what is available on YouTube. There's all sorts of excellent scholars speaking on this subject now. You can watch their lectures on YouTube. There's so much available in terms of history and international relations expertise. In particularly, the work of these journalists in Ukraine is, to me, is so important and so heroic. And I'm really grateful and proud of the work that news reporters have been doing for the last almost 3 weeks. As we begin, I'd just like to mention that I was fortunate to travel to Kiev and Kharkiv numerous times in the 1990s. I was hired by the World Bank to assist probably 4 mid-sized Ukrainian industrial companies in the area around Kharkiv to put together what are called industrial restructuring plans. And so I would go there, numerous times and meet with the management of these companies, and then meet with the Ministry of Industry in both in Kharkiv and also in Kiev. So I've walked on these streets that are now being contested, and I've been inside the buildings that have now been leveled by rocket fire. It doesn't make me an expert by any means, but at least I have some exposure to the very complicated political history of Ukraine. I'd like to begin by reading, I'm going to ask Ashley to save my voice, our assistant pastor, Sun-Hyung Miller, to read to us a section from chapter 4, the chapter on eschatology of the Exposition of Divine Principles. We know the Divine Principle book, the first 2 versions of that book were actually written by the founder of Unificationism, Reverend Sun Myung Moon. He's the original author of the earliest versions of the Divine Principle. So this book is part of the founding scripture of the Unification faith. And for those of us who might not have read the book in some time, I think perhaps some of this content that Sun Myung Miller is about to read might be a bit of a surprise, a reminder to us. Let's welcome our assistant pastor.
From page 99, let us investigate how the history of the rise and fall of nations has been progressing toward the goal of restoring the sovereignty of good, thereby leading us into the last days. It is an error brought about by ignorance of the fundamental providence of God to regard the cause of struggles and wars as mere conflicts of interest and contests between ideologies. Humankind has suffered through a sinful history ever since the first human ancestors fell under the subjugation of Satan. However, as long as God's purpose of creation still stands, the purpose of this history must be to cut our ties with Satan and restore God's kingdom. If there were no wars or divisions in this fallen world, then the sovereignty of evil would continue forever, and the world would never be restored. Therefore, God has worked his providence to restore the heavenly sovereignty by degrees. He sends prophets and saints to the fallen world to found religions and raise the level of morality. He establishes governments with higher standards of goodness, which come to oppose and destroy regimes with lower standards of goodness. To fulfill the providence of restoration, therefore, conflicts and wars are unavoidable. Although there have been times when evil seemed to prevail, in the end, the relatively evil social and political forces declined and were absorbed by the more godly forces. The wars which have shaped the rise and fall of nations are thus unavoidable during the course of the providence to reestablish the reign of good. From page 100, God's providence has brought about a progressive transformation of the hearts of people and has nurtured their original nature, which seeks goodness through religion, philosophy, and ethics. This inner nurturing has inspired groups which seek a just rule to separate from the prevailing evil. This process of separation has culminated in the establishment of two opposing powers on the global level. From page 101, the flow of human history in which good and evil are gradually separated may be compared to muddy water. When muddy water is flowing slowly, the mud sinks to the bottom while the clear water rises to the top, until eventually the mud and water are completely separated. Human history is similar. With the passage of time, the evil sovereignty slowly sinks to destruction, while the good sovereignty gradually ascends on the path of prosperity. All people in this era will suffer through great ideological confusion, much as the first human ancestors, at the point of their temptation, were utterly confused as to whom they should obey and what should guide their actions.
Thank you, Sun Young. I know there are some who would advise us that we no longer need to see the world or local events using this Cain-Abel framework. Some people think that that's become, in this age, an obsolete way of thinking. This idea is that conflicts can generally be divided into Cain and Abel camps representing relative good and relative evil, respectively. Relative evil and relative good, respectively, excuse me. Certainly the day will come, very soon I hope, when that framework is obsolete. However, at least from my perspective, this framework, which is confirmed in both the Bible and the divine principle, is directly relevant to understanding what is going on today in Ukraine. Last week, our assistant pastor, Sun Hyung Miller, read to us excerpts of an excellent essay by Gordon Anderson, laying out the perspectives of Cain and Abel in descriptive detail. Father Moon taught us that the aggressor, the side that strikes first, is the side of Cain, the side of relative evil. The side with the lower sense of morality, the side with a lower standard of goodness. But that the side of Abel, the side of relative goodness, will eventually prevail. Let us remember that God does not want Cain and Abel to actually fight. God's preference is for good and evil to be separated through a Cold War and finally resolved through reconciliation. It's God's preferred course that Abel empathetically love and serve Cain, to allow Cain to heal over time and finally get past his justifiable pain and anger, and then that he can become reconciled in heart with his younger brother, and then they can move forward together to a new and higher level of goodness. This is always the best way for the providence to move to a new level, a new standard of goodness, leaving behind the polluted presence of relative evil. With this understanding, it is helpful, as we did last week, I believe, and instructive to go back to the Bible and be reminded of how God counseled Cain in hopes that he would not attack his younger brother. This is from Genesis chapter 4, verses 5 to 8. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you so angry? Why is your face so downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." God wants the anger and the resentment and the evil to be separated out of Cain's heart and left behind without fighting. God admonished Cain to do what is right, to rule over the violent anger in his heart, even though that anger may well be justified. But Cain could not do that, so he started a war. So when conflict does arise, God then, as we just read from the principle, God then does use war as a secondary course to separate out evil from good so that providential history can progress forward to a new level of goodness, of separation from evil. The thesis of this sermon is that God can use the war in Ukraine to allow providential history to establish the sovereignty of goodness, to move forward. And this is done by allowing clear emergence and identification of both sides, and that once the side of relative evil attacks, to allow it to be defeated by the side of goodness. This is what it says in the principle. Through this process, the relative standard of goodness, the sovereignty of goodness, can be consolidated and advanced. This has been the dynamic behind many wars in the providential history, most vividly during the 2 world wars in Europe, through which the evils of fascism were finally left behind, were separated out, were left behind, fell into destruction. And the liberal democracies of Europe were finally allowed to take firm root. We saw that in the last century. We learn from the principle this final worldwide confrontation between Cain and Abel is a war between the Christian democratic world and the atheistic communist world. And we thought that that war had been over as a result of a Cold War. This is why this war in Ukraine seems to be so confusing to us. Yes, it is confusing because this war was not necessary. It is not the inevitable result of providential history. The issues between Russia and Ukraine should have somehow been resolved with the help of Abel in the decades following the end of the Civil War, primarily during the 1990s. which is the time when I was there. What we now have is a hot war between two opposing cultures, two opposing standards of goodness. The culture and standard of liberal democracy versus the culture and standard of authoritarianism. I would say that the authoritative Russian regime, with its ruthless, heartless disregard for the sacred value of every human life, which is now on full display every day in Ukraine, is a proxy for communism, which is a materialistic version of authoritarianism. And we do know that the government of China, the Chinese Communist Party, is aligned with the Putin government in Russia. In fact, Russia and China cut a deal earlier this year, agreeing that the war would not begin in Ukraine until after the Olympics were over in China. They agreed on the schedule of this invasion. This is a tacit approval of the Russian invasion of Ukraine by the leadership of the Communist Party in China. Furthermore, we are keenly aware that China has its own Ukraine. China has a neighboring country with which it has long historic ties, whose sovereignty it claims it should control, and whose sovereignty it wants to replace. This is the nation of Taiwan. Taiwan is the Chinese equivalent of Ukraine. So China, therefore, is watching very carefully, observing how the regime and culture of authoritarianism does and will fare in its conflict with the regime and culture of liberal democracy. And that is why President Zelensky correctly states that this war is not just a war between Ukraine and Russia. This war is a war that points to the future of democracy. This is a battle of David and Goliath on the worldwide level. In terms of sheer military might, as you know, all the experts have told us that the Russian government has overwhelming military superiority. And therefore, on paper, the Ukrainian military has no chance to prevail. On the other hand, my opinion, that is based on the principle, is that the basic ground rules in providential war are that the side that is most united is the side that wins. There is power, spiritual, godly power in unity. This is a core gospel of unificationism. When I first joined the unification movement, we put a lot of emphasis right now on filial piety. It's beautiful, beautiful teaching of Dr. Young. When I was a young unificationist, the core value was unity, because we know that if we were united, we could accomplish anything. Where there is no unity, there is no hope, there's no power. True, sustainable, godly power comes from unity. Which is why the side of goodness, where there is unity, a shared unity based upon a shared higher principle of purpose, tends to prevail. Because the side of goodness is much more able to create lasting and sustainable unity centered upon that higher purpose. I'm talking about unity between soldiers who are fighting together. Unity between commanders and their soldiers, their troops. The unity between presidents and military commanders. Unity between the president and the leadership within the government. unity between the citizens of the nation with their president, unity among the citizens of the nation, unity of the nation together with its allies, and unity among allies. It is my amateur understanding of Ukrainian history, which is a very complicated and turbulent and long history. It may be, I think it's safe to say that the people of Ukraine have never been more united as a country and have a greater sense of national identity than they have right now. And they have a president who they appear to be proud of, who is representing them well in the international stage, and who they want to support. On the other hand, the Russian invaders are motivated by falsehoods, lies, and propaganda. This is the basis for a false purpose and a superficial and unsustainable unity. So therefore, unless something dramatic changes among these factors, I believe eventually Ukraine will prevail and the side of authoritarianism will fail. However, we expect that history will record unimaginable death and destruction in Ukraine along the way, we're so sorry to say. And this is suffering not just for Ukraine, but also for the people of Russia. You may think that this is a sort of a superficial, simplified, biased view of a very complex situation with a long history. Russia does have a long history as an empire, as a great empire, going back many centuries to the Tartars and the Mughals, alongside a long and very important and historical role of the Russian Orthodox Church. And based on that experience, I understand that they have a consciousness of being an empire, surrounded by enemies and vulnerable to their enemies. They absolutely have that consciousness of being invaded once again, particularly from the West. There's almost nothing to stop an invasion geographically between Western Europe and Moscow. Nothing, except for a few rivers. Therefore, the Russians definitely have their own deep historical narrative, which is paved by centuries of suffering and austerity and sacrifice that seems to justify their claims. Their claims for empire, their specific claims for sovereignty in Ukraine. And at the same time, we know that they feel strong accusations against the United States and the West. And this adds to their motivation. As I understand it, the centerpiece of their accusation against the West is the decadent, sexualized culture of Western democracies, which I know none of us want to defend. And we can add to that motivation a sense of profound insensitivity demonstrated by the threatening eastward expansion of NATO beginning in the 1990s. Which is a topic that's most widely debated right now as a previous cause of this conflict. Therefore, if we want to understand the heart of Abel, heart of Cain, and eventually help our Russian brothers and sisters, we cannot replicate the insensitive, indifferent attitude that we imagine Abel had toward the bitter heart of his older brother. We cannot disregard ancestry, which is core to any struggle in the providence. This is a fundamental, principled appreciation of history, is understanding people based upon the providential history that they represent before us. We cannot disregard the impact of Russian ancestry, this long history and perceptions of the West that are deep in the heart of both Vladimir Putin and the tens of millions of Russian citizens who do support what he is now doing in Ukraine. Father Moon taught us that we are now living in the era of high noon, an era in which the bright light of truth is shining directly overhead, such that every shadow caused by being out of alignment with the principle is clearly apparent. The war in Ukraine is taking place in this high noon context. Every miscalculation, every lie, every act of inhumanity, every atrocity, every corruption will become known. Some of it will become known in tonight's evening news. Some will become known once the studies are released and once the history books are finally written. Video cameras, social media, commentators and spectators, spy satellites, informants, newspaper reporters, researchers, and the eventual authors of best-selling tell-all books are almost everywhere in this war. The separation of good and evil is occurring in this revolutionary context of transparency and accountability. Those people who testify falsely, who withhold documents, who claim privileges, who control and shut down the media, who jail protesters, who outlaw the use of truthful words, who stifle the results of academic research, who misuse others for their own benefit, these actions clearly reveal now what side of history they're on. It's so obvious. What they are doing is futilely attempting to block out the sun that shines brightly down upon them from overhead. And the standard of goodness of this age, the standard of judgment in this age of high noon is very well known. Father Moon taught us over and over again, this is not the age of political power, of popularity, of great wealth and lofty titles and big egos being respected. That is not the age we live in. People like that, the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world, are thrown in jail. This is not an age when bullies can have their way any longer. That was the standard of morality in the 19th century. This is an age where each and every individual's life is understood by the vast majority of people in the world. We all, according to the merit of the age, understand the preciousness and the sacredness of every single unique human life, all deserving of equal respect and equal protection. Regardless of tribe, regardless of race, regardless of gender, regardless of religious faith or nationality, none of that matters. Each of us is created by God as an individual truth body, as an expression or projection of God's own character. The ruthless violations of that standard, which we see occurring in Ukraine, are what make this war so repulsive, so shocking, and makes it so easy to distinguish between the side of relative good and relative evil. Remember that conflict can be used to separate relative good from relative evil. Therefore, it is our belief that when Cain is defeated in this war, the era of inhumane autocracy will be forced to disappear Just like in the analogy that Sun Young read us about dirt being filtered and falling away so the clear water can rise to the surface. I believe the Russian invasion of Ukraine will actually hasten this process of separation. Unfortunately, this historical process requires unimaginable sacrifice. What is universally respected in this age is selfless service and sacrifice for the benefit of others. Not bullying others, but respecting for others and caring for others, living for the sake of others. That's the standard of goodness in this age, since the true parents are here. When the mud is separated from the water through this transparent process of high noon, that will be the age that we are living in. And finally, I'd like to remind us that Dr. Young is teaching us that God's will is for total salvation. At the end of providential history, everyone, every last person, even those who were the most wicked, will be invited to receive the blessing of our true parents and will have a place sitting at God's table. There are no favorites. There's no special privileged class. There's no in crowd, no guarantees for anyone. Let us not think that God is any less concerned for the Russian soldier and for the tens and millions of Russians who support Vladimir Putin than he is for the suffering people of Ukraine. God is committed to every one of us. These are the ground rules that apply to every person, to every nation now. We are living in the era of high noon, and we will all be judged by the standard of this age, the age of living and serving for the benefit of others. This age in which we are expected to treat every person as a precious, precious creation of God, and to learn to practice a lifestyle of living sacrificially for the benefit of others. Thank you.